Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I have read this week. And there have been a few others that I'm not going to mention just because they're very bookery. I've been finishing reading the Booker Winners, which I've now done. So yay. So some videos coming out about the Booker Winners coming up shortly. But I figured that was going to be a lot of an onslaught of just winners back to back, and nobody needs that. So let's talk about some other books that I read this week, and let's get going. First up, I read Isdal by Susannah Dickey. And this is a really interesting book in many ways. It's kind of something that I sort of just took a bit of a punt on after I sort of saw it online on sort of BorrowBox or Libby or something. And I thought, sure, why not? And it's a collection of poems that is in some ways quite a little bit more narrative than that would suggest. They almost read at times like short essays or like a kind of a continuous sort of narrative piece talking about things as varied as true crime and various other kind of things about how we relate that to day-to-day society. So the core idea behind Isdal, and particularly the first section of the book, Isdal was the sort of name given to a woman who was murdered in Norway, and she was known as the Isdal woman. And so this book examines the idea of how we talk about that murder having happened, how we talk about the crime, the after effects, the family, all of those sorts of things. And she ties it to a bigger narrative piece around gender-based violence and around the ways that we talk about women in society. All of which is really quite staggering as a piece of work. I don't know quite how she does it in terms of pulling all of this together, but it was fun reading this. I say fun. It was interesting reading this after something like Penance by Eliza Clark, which also examines the real problematic ways that we as society often consume things like true crime, the way that it's often presented as this sort of entertaining, politically neutral thing that exists within a vacuum that humans are sort of drawn to because of the human element of it and the kind of shock factor. But I think what Isdal does really well is subverts that and plays around with the idea of why do we need to know this, but equally plays into some of the sort of addresses some of the broader narratives about how we might start to frame some of the conversations that we have about women and women's existence within society. So I thought this was a really clever book in how it plays with it. And it does occasionally read like poems, but it also does really read like a kind of narrative piece. And so I think that's what's so clever about this. There's a real genre blending going on that I found really quite captivating. It at times will sort of reference philosophers like Georges Bataille, but then it will come back and talk about something else. And it does all of this in this really sort of visceral, very real way. Next, I read Disorientation by Elaine, Hsieh, Chou. And this I thought was really interesting in many ways. I feel like these first two books are very much echoes of other books I've read this year in a really exciting way. So this reminded me a lot of Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, partly because they deal with some of the same ideas around plagiarism, about the idea of yellowface, and how that kind of gets played out. This takes a slightly different tack to Yellowface by Kuang, and does something quite interesting, I think, as well. So the core idea of this is that at the heart of it, we have a discussion about who gets to tell various stories and who gets to be ideal representation for certain people. And so at the beginning, we have a sort of a Chinese American woman who is studying at university and doing her PhD on a Chinese poet. And he is this kind of cult figure in Chinese American poetry. He is this sort of, the first person you read on a sort of reading list about this topic. You have to engage with his work in some ways. He's sort of one of the classics. But what starts to happen is a few of the characters start to poke holes in that being a realistic and real thing and start to suggest that perhaps he is not the writer. And it sort of starts following almost like a mystery novel of trying to unpick the real truth behind whether or not he actually is the author. And what starts to come up as a result is this really in-depth conversation about representation, because some people say, for example, well, you know, if he's Chinese American, then this stands. But if he's not Chinese American, does that diminish the importance of these poems? He's still written them and they're still valid in some way. Does the fact that he's not Chinese American deviate from that experience? Many of the people who are calling it out are equally either not Chinese American because they're not Chinese, or because they're not American. And so there's also a discussion about whether they can be part of that same conversation. And really it then turns into a bit of a send-up of various strongly held political stances, both on the side of representation by identity and sort of identity politics, and also sort of sending up the other side of that argument as well, with these people who are sort of, you know, truth tellers, who just want to tell it like it is, and, you know, the US is the best place in the world, and blah blah blah. And it really plays on both of those ideas quite powerfully, I think, and offers a critique that's sort of somewhere in the middle, that recognizes the nuance and the messiness of this conversation. And it's really fascinating in quite a few ways, because it does fall into that kind of, it's almost like a campus novel mystery at the heart of it, that really then plays with some of these bigger ideas. So I really admired what this book was doing. I thought it was really clever and really fun in a lot of ways. So yeah, really highly recommend it. Next, I read Ruby Wax's book, I'm Not As Well As I Thought I Was. And this is a non-fiction book. Ruby Wax, from the US, but sort of really finding her sort of her home almost in the UK. Not only in terms of success, where she was, particularly in kind of early 2000s, was everywhere in the UK, but also, you know, just that's where she actually lives now, I think, as well. But anyway, this book is a lot of her talking about her mental health, and particularly her really struggling with mental illness. And she talks with real candid truth in this book about her experiences, and, you know, the ways that she would often try to numb some of the voices in her head by or sort of impulses she was having by going to things like meditation retreats. And she also finds out, as she's doing it, that, you know, often she is demanding just as much of her brain as she was before, but now it's all kind of couched under the idea of sort of wellness. So, you know, she will come out of a wellness retreat and immediately go back to work and immediately do these other things and run at 1,000,000 miles per hour at various things, and then completely burn out and suffer an episode again. And so I think what's really powerful about this book is that even if this is not an experience you are sharing with her, there are elements of what she's talking about that are. So, for example, she talks about, she often will go on all of these trips and be constantly working and going to places, but because she never has time in between to really stop and reflect, it not only feels like a sort of conveyor belt or, you know, sort of running machine for her, it also feels like she's never really appreciated the beauty of what she's just done, or the lessons she's just learned. And that's something that kind of struck me, where I sort of was like, oh, this is an interesting thing that I hadn't really considered, about sort of really having those little moments of pause in between, where things are a bit mundane and they are a bit whatever, you know, you kind of just float through. So I thought this is a really interesting book, and I really admire her honesty in this book. And I mean, she being, you know, Ruby Wax being a comedian, there are still incredibly funny parts in this book, but what I think is really important, and she mentions this at one point, is how she's not trying to bat away any kind of honesty with comedy. She is being incredibly honest and then trying to find some humor, and there's an important distinction there for her that I think really works in this book. And last but not least, I read Sebastian Barry's The Secret Scripture. And although this is part of a Booker project bit of reading, I just wanted to sort of talk about this book because I think I just found it so engaging and beautiful. So The Secret Scripture is focused around a woman called Roseanne, who is... we learn at the beginning of the book is this elderly woman who is in a psychiatric unit. And when they go to shut down the psychiatric unit, they sort of think, well, why is she actually here? None of us have ever questioned it. We've just known she's been here all this time. And they dig into it and they find out this sort of history to her. And without spoiling anything, essentially what comes out of it is that she's been failed multiple times. So she went through some incredibly tricky moments in life, and instead of being supported, she was seen as being a problem that was in need of kind of going to a psychiatric unit. And what sort of slowly reveals itself in this book is how so many of those parts could have been avoided. So, you know, a large part of her initial thing of being seen as an outsider was that she was a woman who was perceived to be promiscuous or what have you. And this was seen as threatening, this was seen as not the done thing. And so as a result, she is sort of ostracized. And then with that ostracization comes increasing challenges in other ways, that she is seen as having, I don't know, that she has made problems for everybody around her. You know, she is, you know, there are certain things that must be done to stop various parts of her life coming to the fore, and in doing so she is treated horribly, and then her response to that horror is to respond in a way that is then medicalized. So I think this book is such an interesting, in-depth portrayal of this really complex life of this woman, and I think Sebastian Barry does this so well. He often finds the sort of the things that are almost illogical inside humans' brains, and comes to find a reason for why there's something quite rational in how they got there. And I think that's something really quite special in this book, is how the character of Roseanne is handled, and how we're given such a complex insight into her as a woman. And so I really greatly appreciated this book. So those are the books I read this week. I'd love to hear your thoughts on either these or on other books you've been reading. Either way, have a great week, take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.